Hello, everybody. Je suis Sidney Winston. Je suis Sidney Winston. Nah, just kidding. I'm Sidney Winston. So today we are going to look further into this shit show that is Mr. Batman, or Jim Barber, or whatever you want to call the dude. So where do we actually start with this guy? I think the best bet is to just bring in a little bit of what do they call it? Receipts. That's what they call it. Yeah, receipts. But so what it is the first thing is going to be Jim's challenge to both me and to Aron Ra. Hello, Odin. How you doing? All right, so I'm just going to what am I going to do? I'm going to try and figure out what I'm doing. There we go. So I did that. Oh, there we go. No problem. No problem. What is this here? Challenge. Yes, that's the one I want. Why don't I see it? I do not see it. There it is. Okay. Sorry, I'm just getting organized here. Okay, so this is actually this is Mr. Batman making his little rant there. Listen to this. This is hilarious, actually.
Well, the last time. Now, I teach very elementary science. I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But I'm not going to go back and forth with you on Facebook and these text things. This thread is so long, I can't even find the comments anymore. So step out of the darkness and into the marvelous light. Come on. Don't be a coward. Step up. Let's have a discussion. Let's talk about it. Now, Mr. Ra, when we were talking the last time, you ran away from the conversation because you realized that you don't know your science as much as you claim to know science. I happen to love science because without the God,
okay, this guy's just digging himself a hole. I'll just let him dig.
Out of the Bible, you cannot do science. So once again, here's my challenge to Aron Ra and to Sidney Winston. Let's go. I'll debate with you guys anytime. I'll debate both of you. You all want to get together. That way you feel better, like you have maybe a majority. Doesn't matter.
Oh, yeah, we're so scared
I'm going to be able to destroy your false worldview of materialism. I know my science. I know my Bible. I know the truth. His name is Messiah, and I'd be happy to introduce you to him because I love the God of the Bible.
Aha! Here's his first mistake.
His name is Yahweh.
Yahweh, Yahuwah, Yahichi, Bohuhu. You might know him by his Greek name, Jesus.
Yahuwah, Yehoshua, Yeshua. You might know him by his Greek name, Jesus. Now, sir, without Jesus, you cannot know anything to be true. Without Jesus, you cannot do the scientific method. You don't have laws of nature and laws of logic. I'm going to go ahead and preempt you. I'm going to give you my entire argument so you can go ahead and start researching it because you don't have an answer. Ready? Here we go. Premise number one. In order for us to have the ability to do science, then we must have laws of nature. That's premise number one. Premise number two, these laws of nature, such as laws of gravity, magnetism, and thermodynamics, they must not change over time.
Like ever?
Okay, that's premise number two. Premise number three, conclusion rather. They must come from an eternal, universal, and unchanging lawgiver God. That's my entire premise. That's my entire argument. Let's go. Why don't you step up?
Okay, so that's his entire argument, eh? His entire argument is this. This is this. Premise number one: laws of nature must exist. Premise number two: laws of nature never change. And premise number and the conclusion, therefore, God. Oh, sorry. Oh crap! Sidney, get out of there. Okay, there you go. Sidney. I mean, Jim's whole argument. Okay, so now that we've seen Jim's whole argument from that point of view, Um, let's see what else he's got for us. We've got this right. You're gonna love this one. I'm getting there. There's a method to this madness. So I don't know if there's more madness and less method, or more method and less madness. I don't know. But whatever it is, we'll find out. That's right. Okay, so we're going to go to the next piece here, and we're going to bring in like that, and just watch this for a couple of minutes.
The one God who created all things, what is his name?
His name's God.
Mr. Sidney Winston, I'm throwing the gauntlet down before you. Come to the table. Let's talk about this. I'm constantly studying the Bible. Even right now, I'm still studying the scriptures while I'm doing this, because I love the Word of God and I want to know it. I want to store the Word of God in my heart so I won't sin against the God that I love. Now, when it comes right down to it, when we look at the English, we have to understand a couple things. First and foremost, there's translator bias. It doesn't matter how awesome and how accurate the translator tries to be, the translator has some basic bias of what he thinks these words means. And you also have the versions, which is the little c problem. Mm-hmm. You have NIV, ASV, KJV, and each one of those has a little c behind them. That's called copyright.
Copyright!
And every time you see that little copyright symbol, that means a certain amount, a certain percentage of that data had to be changed in order for them to get that copyright and make money. Mm-hmm. That's why you don't want to stick with any one version of the scripture. No. You want to read the original language whenever possible. Yes. That's why I love studying the Paleo Hebrew, the original language.
The original language. Now, let me, I don't want to be on here twice because I'm taking up too much space. So, this is me stepping up to the plate.
Psalms, Book 1, verse 1. Tehillim, Sefer Rishon, Perek Aleph. Ashrei haish asher lo halach, ba'atzat rishaim uvaderech chataim, lo amad, v'moshav leitzim lo yashav. That's the original, Mr. Batman. I know you don't like translations, so let's discuss the original language. בוא נשוחח קצת. בסדר? אני יושב כאן ואני מחכה לך.
There you go. So there's my challenge. But the good thing about this challenge is that I don't need Mr. Batman, because it's not a debate. There is no debate. I can just debunk everything that he has said by discussing Genesis 1:1 in its original form. Now, there's certain things I need to show you, to share with you. Firstly, I want to replay that little bit here where he talks about his Paleo Hebrew nonsense. Let's see if I found it right.
Make money. That's why you don't want to stick with any one version of the scripture. You want to read the original language whenever possible. That's why I love studying the Paleo Hebrew.
Okay, so he loves studying the Paleo Hebrew, as he calls it. The original. What does he say?
Original language.
The original language. Okay then, Mr. Batman. If you like the original language so much, then why don't we have a discussion? Except you can't discuss unless you come online right now. If you say you're in the side chat, if you're in the side chat watching live, then come on, I'll give you a lesson live. If not, I'll have to give you a lesson this way. So let me give you a bit of a background. Firstly, Mr. Batman claims that he's been studying the Paleo Hebrew. Well, I'm claiming that I've been studying Hebrew, and here's I'll give you a little bit of a tour through my little history here. This here is the the dictionary that I first started using when I started studying Hebrew. I still have it. Here today. And in this dictionary, I'm going to prove Mr. Batman that his original language argument, if that's what he's sticking with, then I pity the fool. Okay, so that's the cover of the of the dictionary. Now I went and I looked up the word in Hebrew, el. All right. Oh, let me first show you that. There you go. That's my. Let me just bring it up a little bit. But that is essentially the inside of this dictionary. And I'm going to just bring it up. Oops. Let me just make it bigger. There you go. All right. So here you go. That's the inside of the dictionary. And I'm looking for the word El. Aleph Lamed El. Okay. And I do find it, luckily, right there. Okay, so all right, so there you go. So I was looking for the word El, which if you understand anything at all about Hebrew, you'll see that the word El or Eloha. It's either El or Elo, but it's commonly known as El. So that is, if you understand the Hebrew letters, it's El is Zachar, which means male, because nouns in Hebrew are male or female, and also they have the resh at the end here, the rabim. Rabim means plural. So when the singular is Eloha or Elo or El, the plural is always Elohim. In other words, gods. Then I went down to where it says Elohim at the bottom here with God judge, and it says Elohim Zachar Rabim, which means Elohim male and plural. So Elohim, according to the language, means gods, right? Gods. Godzilla. So that's what it means, Godzilla. Okay? So there we have it on that one. Okay, so now I just want to show you something. Look at all these translations. Jim, you're right. Look at all these translations, Jim. This is terrible. Terrible. Look, translation after translation after translation. But we're not going to bother about that, aren't we, Jim? We're not going to bother about the translations, right? Because, as you said, they all changed. Take the original Hebrew, which is what we're going to do. Ka-ching! We're going to take the original Hebrew. Now, let me just get rid of myself. And, all right, so here we go. Original Genesis 1:1. I'm going to bring this. I'm going to just zoom this in a little bit. A little bit more, maybe. Okay. All right, so basically, that's it. All right. Let's see if I can give myself a little bit of a... maybe. Yeah, let's see. I want to be able to... There we go. Got the whole... Oops. I'm going to go this way. Okay. So, Jim, let's go through this in the original Hebrew because you're such a fucking expert. Here you go. All right, I moved it over. There you go. Okay, so let's read it in the Hebrew. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Okay, now this should be very easy for you, Jim, because it's got the vowels. Ready? Bereshit, in the beginning, firstly, once upon a time, bara, created, Elohim, gods, in the plural, et hashamayim. In the beginning, God created the sky, ve'et haaretz, and the land, the sky and the land. Genesis 1:1, in its original, says, in the beginning, gods created the skies and the earth. So your one God theory, Jim, has been nuked, because gods in the Bible, Genesis 1:1 says gods. Okay, there's no way you can get around this, Jim. Your one God theory is defeated. Now, I'd like anybody, if they're just going to talk about the original language, like Jim says, with no translation, this is what I get for you. In the beginning, gods created the skies and the earth. Gods. Now I know you want to discuss this, but I think your discussion, your point of view on this is now moot, because every time you mention God with reference to Genesis 1:1, you are misinterpreting. Your translation sucks, because it's not God, it's gods. Now, if we want to discuss how gods created the skies and the earth and the land, sure, we could do that, but we already know that it's fake, that it's all what's the right word? Oh yeah, nonsense, bullshit. That's what it is. So, Jim, on this first point, I've taken you to task on Genesis 1:1. I've shown you that without translating, and you take just on the original word, the original language alone, all Christians and all Jews and all Muslims have been mistranslating Elohim, which is gods, and they translate it to God. So there you go. I don't have to go any further in the Bible to debunk your bullshit argument. Okay? Which is, if anybody needs to know, is this right here. Look at that. That's his whole argument. Laws of nature must exist, laws of nature never change, and therefore God. Guy's an absolute Looney Tune. Bloody Looney Tune is what he is. Okay, so there you have it, in terms of my presentation to Mr. Batman, proving to him that his Bible, his translation, all translations are wrong. The original language of the Bible is Genesis 1:1 is gods, plural. All right. Now, I want Mr. Batman needs to. Mr. Batman needs to learn some science. He says he loves science, so therefore he must love learning science, right? You think? So I'm going to bring in a playlist from Aron Ra, and let me just line it up here. I'm going to bring a playlist in and let Aron teach science to all of us, really. Science and evolution. Evolution is a is a non-debatable scientific fact, and in this series of short videos, our friend Aron is going to explain everything. So, Mr. Batman, you're about to get yourself an
reason with
education.
faithful believers, especially religious extremists like creationists, we keep hearing the same old arguments over and over and over again, even though we know they've already been shown to be false, fraudulent, and or fallacious, probably by everyone who's ever seen them. If you keep it up, you'll suspect that those who keep repeating these must surely know by now that all of these points have already been refuted 1,000 times. I'm Aron Ra, and this is the Pratt List.
Yeah.
The first item on the Pratt List is a biggie. It's the God of the Gaps fallacy, which imagines that science can't explain it, therefore God. And that means exactly the same thing as, I don't understand it, so I guess it must be magic. And by magic, I mean all supernatural things traditionally and typically described as magical. Curses, potions, enchantments, incantations, necromancy, golem spells, transformation, exorcism, purification rituals, weather control, ghosts, demons, angels, fire-breathing dragons, faith healing, forecasting, water bending, and all other supernatural manifestations or conjurations such as the Bible repeatedly describes. The reason you can't tell the difference between divine miracles and genie magic is because there is no difference. They're the same thing. If magic was real, then characters like Spock or Gandalf or Obi-Wan would be able to demonstrate that in some reliable way. Parapsychologists would have actual ectoplasm that you can study in the lab, and faith healers would work in hospitals healing amputees. But the reason none of that has happened is because none of it is real. That's why we have dozens of children dying every year because their parents prayed for them instead of seeking medical attention. Prayer is no different than, in fact, it's the same thing as wishing upon a star, which is why it doesn't work. That's why prophetic seers never predict anything accurately, and religious apologists are always scientifically and historically, ethically, and morally absolutely wrong about absolutely everything. You get more reliable results from a magic 8-ball, and that's just a toy based on random chance. If it's unexplained by science, that doesn't mean it's explained by magic. If science can't explain it, religion can't explain it either. Gods and magic don't explain anything anyway. Believers say you can't explain everything without God, but they can't explain anything with God. All defenders of the faith can do is pretend to know things they don't know and assert empty, baseless speculation as though it were fact. In other words, they can make up lies and talk out of their ass, but that's about it. And once upon a time, when everything was unexplained by science, our ancestors believed that thunder, lightning, and volcanoes were gods in action, that comets were an omen, that the stars and planets had human characteristics, that sickness was a curse of witchcraft, and that epilepsy was demonic possession. But all those assertions of superstitious nonsense were already wrong even before science could give us the real answers. In each case, the reality was a revelation of whole new fields of study, previously unimagined and vastly more complex than anyone's imagined deity. No doubt that pattern will continue, such that if we ever learn the cause of the Big Bang, or complete explanations for the origin of life, the universe, and everything, they'll each be a wealth of new information with practical application and so advanced as to render our previous belief in gods, ghosts, and magic just as laughably silly as every other field of study so far has already shown. The God of the gaps refers to the gaps in our understanding. The more science can explain, the fewer pockets of ignorance there are for God to hide in. That's why God once lived on a mountain until we climbed it, then he moved to the clouds until we could fly, and now he has to hide in another dimension that doesn't exist either, so that we'll never be able to prove he was never there, even though he was never anywhere other than right here. The God of the gaps is a logical fallacy composed of a combination of other logical fallacies, beginning with question begging. This is the circular argument routing back to the assumed conclusion. Asking who created the universe, for example, presupposes that someone created it when that's not even possible. Before you can say that anything is possible, there has to be some precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that such possibility exists. Until you can show there's such a possibility, there isn't one, and God is thus not possible. It's not just that these other things can't exist without God, it's that God himself cannot exist. So everything that does and is requires another explanation, one that actually is an explanation, providing a mechanism that isn't magic, that is supported by evidence, which God isn't, and which accounts for all the facts, which God doesn't. Tide goes in, tide goes out. God can't explain that. The other logical fallacies that make up the God of the gaps are the arguments from ignorance and incredulity. Incredulity says, I can't believe it, therefore it isn't true. But reality stubbornly persists regardless whether you want to accept it or not. Real things don't care if you believe in them. In all the universe, the only thing that requires or desires your faith is a con man trying to exploit your confidence. Deceivers seek believers. You might think that the argument from ignorance might be something like, I never heard of such a thing, so that can't be true. But no, that's actually another combination of fallacies, beginning with false dichotomy. That if it's not this, then it's got to be that, because I'm not even going to consider that there might be other options. Of course, there usually are other options, and the right answer is often one of them. Religion encourages all sorts of unverifiable and immaterial subjective opinions based on ignorant emotions, but it never produces anything we can objectively show to be true. There's never been one time in the history of history where religion ever turned out to be right about anything. And knowledge differs from mere belief in that knowledge is testable with measurable accuracy, allowing ways to show which position is right or wrong or more accurate. So the only things we actually know are the things we can show with science. That's why I say that science doesn't know everything, religion doesn't know anything. The second item on the Pratt list is a combination of them in the fallacy of false equivalence, presenting the illusion that the only two alternatives being presented are somehow equally valid or two sides of the same coin. You might think that these are both comparable opinions being weighed on a scale, but no. When we're talking about science versus pseudoscience, or the denial of science by religious extremists like creationists, who object to scientific principles and methodology, there is no comparison. They're not even opposites. We're talking about testable scientific data supported by everything everywhere, no matter what you want to believe, versus a book of fables that is not supported by anything anywhere and can neither be indicated nor vindicated, verified or falsified, and can only be believed by the obstinate will of desperate pretenders.
Right.
They want to be like, you have your beliefs and I have mine, but no, it's not like that at all. Believers treat belief as an act of will, of mind over matter, the power of positive thought, that you can change reality if you just believe hard enough.
Yeah, right.
So their position is literally make-believe, compared to what is objectively, demonstrably true. Our position is not mere belief, it's knowledge. And as I said in the previous video, they don't know what they pretend to know. We can prove that we do.
Yes.
So here's how they construct the illusion of false equivalence. First, because many different independent fields of scientific study all concord with each other and align against the lunatic fringe who deny reality and believe in fairy tales over what we can prove to be true, then the wanna-believers must conflate evolution, abiogenesis, Big Bang cosmology, plate tectonics, phylogenetics, and all other related sciences and put them all in the same box as if there's only one opposing position. Which is actually correct if the choices are reasonable versus unreasonable, honest versus dishonest, because this really is fact versus fantasy, literally, and it would be inappropriately polite to say that there's anything more than that. Then defenders of the faith dismiss or ignore all other religions as if theirs is the only one to be considered, and they even ignore believers in their own religion who are factually accurate, dismissing them with the no true Scotsman fallacy, thus conflating science with atheism too. And then they conflate atheism with communism, nihilism, and devil worship, but that'll be the subject of another video. Now we have a false dichotomy. Then they label the demonstrably true side evolutionism, as if accepting reality is just another religious belief, and they present the inane ravings of ignorant, superstitious primitives as though that were the word of God and the absolute truth, despite everything wrong with all that. At this point, they can dip into a bucket of other lies to imply that science is just as bad as religion, or that religion is just as good as science. It's an Orwellian revision in labeling the lack of faith as just a different faith and the rejection of science as an alternative science with alternative theories based on alternative facts, which of course means that they're not facts, not theories, and not science. And this is where you hear the lies that faith is based on evidence just like science is, and science depends on faith just like religion does, and we both have the same evidence, we're just interpreting it differently. But no, none of that is true either.
None.
Believers don't even care about evidence, and science is the antithesis of faith because it requires an evidentiary basis for all postulations, and all hypotheses must be testable and potentially falsifiable. Faith can't and won't conform to any of that. And now comes the equivocation fallacy, where everything is redefined, often into its opposite, or where different contexts are deceptively alternated. For example, religious extremists will say that science relies on faith because faith is no more than trust. But that's false. Faith is more than trust. It's a complete trust that is not based on evidence, meaning there's no reason to believe it, but they believe it anyway. Science has to have a body of facts to back it up. Some believers accept the definition of faith as provided by every definitive or authoritative source and thus admit they believe impossible nonsense for no good reason. And somehow they're okay with that. Others want to reverse the definition of faith, pretending that it is a belief that is based on evidence. However, in each such case, they will either try to say that I don't have evidence and they don't have enough faith to believe as I do without that, which is an admission that I was right, that faith really is a belief that is not based on evidence, and they knew that already. Or I'll challenge them to show me what evidence convinced them to believe as they do, and what evidence would change their mind. These believers will not honestly answer either question, because evaluating evidence was never how they got there in the first place, and they're determined not to be swayed by it either.
Right.
And that's why creationist organizations publish statements of faith as if this were something to be proud of, wherein they admit they've assumed their conclusion without reason and will defend it against all reason, so that no amount of proof will ever change their minds. That is the very opposite of science, and that is why I say that faith is the most dishonest position it is possible to have. I've run into many religious believers who insist they have evidence for their faith, but they very often redefine evidence too, such that even logical fallacies like the God of the gaps can be considered a reason to believe, because the way they define it, evidence is not evident, because facts are not factual, and nothing can ever be objectively verified. Historians use a slightly different application when comparing interpretations of historic records, but otherwise, the same fact cannot be evidence of two different mutually exclusive conclusions at the same time. A fact is just a point of data, and if it is not objectively verifiable, then it's not a fact. And it doesn't become evidence until it indicates or eliminates one option over another. If you don't believe me, look it up. The fact that we can observe evolution happening, both micro and macro, whether we're tracing it to the genome or the fossil record, or seeing evolutionary developments recapitulated in developmental sequences in embryo, or actually watching organisms evolve in real time into new species in controlled conditions in the lab, these facts are evidence of evolution. They are not also evidence of creation by any possible interpretation. Our growing lists of beneficial mutations and transitional species and our phylogenetic classification among the other apes and many, many other examples of the demonstrable facts of evolution are also evidence of it, because these facts are positively indicative of and exclusively concordant with evolution, while being inconsistent with and contradicting creationism, which has no facts indicating it whatsoever. So we do not both have the same evidence. There is no evidence for creation, nor for the fables in the Bible, nor for God either. Not even the circular argument of looking at a sunset and imagining that God did it. After 20 years as an anti-theist activist advocating science education, working with, debating with, and learning from professional scientists and theologians, sometimes both in the same person, if anyone had evidence of gods or souls or miracles or psionic powers, I'd know about it by now. We all would.
Yes, indeed. What's next?
This is a lie that I've seen repeated all my life. The people who made up this slogan didn't make an innocent mistake. This is a deliberately deceptive distortion. Is this God so petty that he would allow violent criminality wherever they don't pray to him? And many evangelicals say, yes, he is that petty. But even if God wasn't allowed in schools, he's certainly allowed in church, right? Yet there are mass shootings and other assorted murders that keep happening in churches too. So what's the excuse for why God allows so much violence in his own holy temple? Some religious extremists complain that public schools are not allowed to fool sequestered children into believing in a single state-supported religion. And no one should want that anyway, certainly not in a land that promises religious freedom. And some believers complain that public schools might teach forbidden knowledge, and they don't want the kids to know the truth or understand reality. So they homeschool them and send them to private schools so that what they'll be taught will only be censored and laced with all the desired lies instead. Everything they want the child to believe rather than know. But science is not a religion. The truth is what the facts are. That's what they're teaching, and every student has a right to know the truth, regardless whether they later choose to reject that in favor of faith, which is also their right. There was never a time when God wasn't allowed in schools. Students were always allowed to believe in whatever God they liked and even pray to them. No one cares if your kids talk to themselves or their imaginary friends, as long as it's not indicative of an actual mental disorder and they're not disrupting the class. Although, It would be best if they followed the example given in Christian scriptures and they only did their praying secretly in the privacy of their own room, like the Bible says. But they can still also be hypocrites and declare their prayers for all to see, though the Bible says they'll receive no reward in heaven if they do. So maybe we shouldn't force them to. There was a time when state-funded public schools forced their pupils to begin each day by reciting 10 verses of a King James Bible. Students had no choice. They were denied their First Amendment rights and had to recite these or hear them out, and they had to do it reverently, required to respect and impose religious belief or be punished. Imagine your children being forced to hear and revere someone else's religion every day, no matter what you say. And sometimes if parents raised a stink over their kids having to go through this daily inculcation, that student would be segregated or even ostracized from the rest of the class. That's what happens whenever the state even seems like it has a favorite religious denomination. Everyone else becomes second-class citizens, having to bow to whatever the state-endorsed religion is. This was not only an annoyance to atheist kids, having to waste their morning reciting lines from irrelevant fables and having to be respectful of it when they don't even believe in God and they have a right not to. It was also a violation of the freedom of religion for Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh kids who may believe in a different God, as well as Muslim or Jewish kids who believe in a different version of God, and even for Christian kids whose churches may object to the King James Version or who might object to their children receiving religious instruction from a chemistry teacher or a gym coach of the wrong denomination, to say nothing of the rights of the teacher, who might be Jewish or atheist or pagan or Mormon, yet has to lead a mixed bag of different religions in prayer to the Christian God, regardless what anyone's religion is or rights are in that classroom. Some American Christians have told me that freedom of religion pertains only to Christians, and that you're only free to believe in Christianity, and that you're not free to believe otherwise. This too is a lie. But if a lie is repeated often enough, people will believe it. And that's what this is all about. This repetition is inculcation of impressionable children, even against the will of their parents. This is also why even little kids are forced to pledge allegiance when they don't even know what that means. It's a similar form of cultural conditioning imposed by people who pretend to believe in free will, but deny that in others and prevent it in children. Remember also that demographics change. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world right now and has been for decades, while over that same period Christianity has been in a general state of decline worldwide and even in the U.S., the last stronghold for Christian religion in the West. That means that Islam will eclipse Christianity soon, and not just in the rest of the world, but even in America. So whatever laws you make on behalf of your own religion today will only pave the way for the next dominant religion tomorrow. How will you feel then about your Christian kids or their Jewish teacher reciting 10 verses from the Quran every morning before being forced to pray to Allah? Especially knowing that teachers will be fired if they don't comply. Wouldn't it be better if we didn't force other people's kids to recite the mantras of any one faith? Wouldn't it be better if we didn't try to force one religion onto everyone, depriving them of their right to believe what they will according to their own conscience? The Founding Fathers knew full well from myriad examples throughout history how all religions are divisive and persecute each other, and how this is always exacerbated when any one of them seizes power over the state to then impose the government religion onto everyone else. Our founders knew that the only way to have freedom of religion was to guarantee freedom from it as well, and that's why they did not found this country on any Judeo-Christian values, but instead created the first ever secular government, where Congress shall make no law even respecting an establishment of religion, which they knew would invariably also prohibit the free exercise thereof. If you agree with this sentiment, then your problem is not that God was kicked out of school, because that never happened. Your problem is that your particular religious views aren't being forced onto everyone else's kids.
Right.
Prayer was never banned in school either. The people who say it was are lying. What really happened was the Supreme Court ruled that state-endorsed schools cannot violate your First Amendment rights as a parent to control which religion your children have to hear and respect and obey. Public schools are for education, not indoctrination. You have the right not to be forced to pray to someone else's God. You should be thankful for that and stop telling lies like this.
Right, Jim.
When defenders of the faith realize they have no valid or reasonable argument, they try to end discussion with an escape excuse, where they say that atheists secretly know that there really is a God, but we pretend there isn't one because we love sin. I must have heard this nonsense 100 times, but every part of that claim is wrong. First of all, it implies that even things we don't believe are still beliefs, as if not believing that something is true or exists means believing it's false or does not exist. The context here is that whether you believe or not is still an act of faith either way, as if no one was ever convinced by the facts, even of things they didn't want to know, but are honest enough to accept. That's what reasonable people do, and that's why they say that the truth hurts and is inconvenient and that the facts are cold and hard. The truth may set you free, but first it might piss you off. And likewise, it is never wise to believe anything claimed by another without question, without reservation, or without reason. Having no reason to believe something is a pretty good reason not to believe it, and being thus unconvinced is precisely what it means to have no faith at all. Not doing something is the default position over doing anything, including existing. You can have positive and negative feelings about something, like giving a thumbs up or thumbs down on YouTube, but if you don't like a Facebook post, it doesn't mean you clicked dislike. That's not even an option, because it doesn't need to be. If you didn't like it, you didn't like it. Same goes for belief. If I don't convince you, then you won't believe me. It doesn't mean that you necessarily believe I'm wrong. You could withhold judgment on that, which means you still wouldn't believe me until or unless I convince you to make up your mind. In this sense, belief is a conviction, and a lack of belief is a lack of conviction. And if you don't know whether it's true or not, then you were obviously not convinced.
Correct.
You don't believe. And most atheists are in this category, and I was too for much of my life. However, I realize now that I can honestly say that I know there is no God. And no one knows there is a God. Belief does...
I gotta say, Aron, fucking, big up, dude. That's exactly what I say. There is no God. Done. No debate, no talking about it, no discussion. Fuck all.
Does not equal knowledge. And while it is not always possible to prove a negative or disprove a negative, whichever that is, I know that there is no God in the same way and to the same degree that I know there are no leprechauns. It's not just that there's no evidence of them, but also because it is impossible for such things to exist.
Right.
It is physically impossible to simply wish things into existence. It is logically impossible for something in the image of an evolved ape to exist prior to the evolution of apes, and it is definitively impossible for a disembodied mind to exist absent the brain that created it, because that's what a mind is, the knowledge, notions, and memories produced by a brain. If God exists outside our reality, then he does not exist in reality. If God is beyond time, then at no time does God exist.
Right.
And before we can know whether something is possible, we must have some precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that possibility. If we can't show that such possibility exists, then we can't honestly say that it does, because it evidently doesn't, and neither does God. Next is the notion of sin. What is that? As some people think that anything that feels good or tastes good is sin, but somehow unnecessarily excessive violence is not always. Depends on who you ask, because every believer seems to have a different idea, and every religion contradicts all the others, even though they all claim to have the same objective source. We'll talk more about that in another video. For the moment, remember that in Abrahamic religions, divorce is strictly forbidden, except when it's okay, and murder is forbidden too, except that you're supposed to kill people who are working on weekends. Because Friday through Saturday and Sunday are all Sabbath to somebody, all according to the same God who reportedly says that virtually every sin is punishable by death, and you're obliged to do that yourself. Sin is supposed to be breaking the laws of God, and everybody does that except those who realize that there are no laws given by God, because there is no God.
Right.
And his laws would be unenforceable, unjust, and indefensibly insane anyway. We have to obey the laws of men instead, and we atheists do a much better job of that than believers do. Statistically, there is a negative correlation between religiosity and moral behavior. And now that the irreligious nuns account for 1/4 of the U.S. population, we are still, for whatever reason, remarkably underrepresented in the prison population. The factions of dominant religions statistically have the highest crime rate, with special emphasis on hate crimes. Instead of turning the other cheek and forgiving those who trespass against us, religious people are more likely to condone the killing or torture of prisoners, where non-religious people are more likely to consider that morally wrong. Now, being atheist doesn't make you a good person, but it doesn't make you a bad person either, just like belief in God obviously doesn't make anyone good, nor does it necessarily make you evil. But embracing either religious or political ideologies can grossly distort your morality. The most religious countries tend to have the highest murder rates, and the same is true of the most religious areas of the United States. The higher the religiosity in a given populace, the higher the rates of violent crime. Nations that are more secular show the opposite tendency, where the less religious they are, the more peaceful they tend to be. Here in the United States, evangelical Christians have the highest divorce rate. They also have the highest rates of teen pregnancy, especially in areas where they taught abstinence only instead of offering sex education. Students in private schools where evolution is not taught are statistically more likely to get an abortion than their peers in public schools where evolution is taught. This is an indictment of religious hypocrisy, and it shows what a colossal failure the policies of the religious right have always been. But it gets even worse than that. Child Protective Services and other agencies report that a significant majority of child abusers and molesters identify as very religious. And the more religious they are, the worse offenders they are, with worse offenses against more and younger victims. Yet, religious people argue that the less religious we are, the less moral we are, which is obviously false, just like everything else they believe. These people think that their God mandates morality, that he judges people by how good or bad they are? If that were true, then the Bible would offer some provision wherein atheists could get into heaven if they're good and kind and charitable, as many of them are. But that's not what the Bible says. It says it doesn't matter how evil you are. All sins will be forgiven if you but believe. But if you don't believe, then it doesn't matter how good you are, because the only sin that will not be forgiven is the sin of disbelief. Your good works are like filthy rags, and you're supposed to believe all this on faith, which means there's no reason to believe it at all. You swallow what you're told just because you're told to, and you dare not question the reason why. Thus, gullibility is the sole criteria for redemption. Then there's the notion that God will just go away if you ignore him, meaning that even believers seem to accept that if you don't believe in God, then he doesn't exist. But if he really did exist, then we're smart enough to realize that we can't just wish him away. And we know that nothing pisses him off more than when people don't believe in him. That's the one thing that guarantees that you'll go to hell. It's also another indication that this is just a game of pretend. But it wouldn't make any sense to pretend he's not real if he really is. So if you love your sin, then accept Jesus as your imaginary friend and keep on doing what you're doing, because he'll forgive you as long as you make believe that he will. But if you can't pretend that things are true when you know they couldn't possibly be, and you say, as I do, that there is no God, you'd better be damned sure of that. And I am, because I have good reason to be. There's an old Chinese story about a Naga goddess, Nu Kwa. She created the first people out of clay. On the other side of the Pacific, Native Americans said that Coyote created the mountains and the rivers and made the fish therein. Of course, in the Middle East, the fabled creator was the Jewish volcano god known as Jehovah, though there were a few other, even older creator gods too. Believers never wonder what these gods were doing before there was a world to do things in, or where they came from, even though they all apparently came from the land of pure imagination. Initially, the religious position was that the earth was a flat disk divided into 4 quadrants, erected on pillars or columns like a map spread out on a table, and that it was covered by a giant crystal dome with windows in it, because these primitive people thought that space was full of water and that these windows are where the rain came from. It was a common belief across Asia, with different religions positing that whichever god might cover the dome of the sky, stretching out the heavens over the firmament like a tent, and sometimes with the stars sewn into the fabric of the veil of night. But in the Jewish tradition, the stars were contained within the expanse of this dome, along with the sun and the moon and all the other planets, which of course were all much, much smaller than the earth and even smaller than the moon. They didn't know that the earth was just another planet, and they didn't know that the sun was one of the stars. They thought that the stars were tiny little things that had thinking minds and personalities, because that's the way the Bible describes them. Not kidding. And this wasn't just in ancient times either. I've actually met people like this. There's an awful lot of people today who still believe in this model, or another similar one without a firmament, where the sun and the moon and all the other planets are still smaller than the earth and orbit around it. They also believe that the earth is the first thing in the universe, the biggest thing in the universe, and of course the center of the universe. And even if they don't hold to such an extreme view, it is alarming how many religious people don't believe in outer space, but do believe that the earth is flat. And there are dedicated religious apologists who accept that the world is round, but still believe that the sun orbits the earth. There are also some who accept that the earth orbits the sun, but think that our solar system is the center of the universe and that everything literally revolves around us. Then we discovered the Big Bang. Astronomers saw that other galaxies were moving away from us fast enough to be redshifted in spectroscopy, such that it appears that the universe is expanding or inflating. If you extrapolate backwards, then everything was closer together in the past, culminating in, or rather originating in, a single point where everything, and I mean everything, flew apart from there. Matter, energy, universal forces, natural laws, and even empty space and time began at that point. So anyone asking about the state of the universe before it existed, or what happened before the beginning of time, obviously doesn't understand the question they're asking. It's like trying to travel to a point south of the South Pole. Religious extremists delight in saying that scientists have proven that the universe had a beginning, and they use that argument against the Big Bang, but the Big Bang is our proof that the universe had a beginning. Cosmologists, cosmogonists, and astrophysicists tried to work out what was happening, and they produced a model in which everything in the universe rapidly erupted from a small, hot, dense state roughly 13.7 billion years ago. This discovery was initially ridiculed as a Big Bang, but the pejorative name-calling stuck, and that's what we call it now. Understand that a goal without a deadline is just a dream, or a prophecy. So any proposed explanation has to have two things. It has to meet certain predictions that should only happen if we're on the right track, and there has to be some way to prove it wrong if we're not. And no one's ever found any data to contradict the Big Bang. So they worked out that if this hypothesis is correct, there should be a particular type of cosmic microwave background radiation to indicate that, and such was actually discovered to exist. It was a Nobel Prize-winning discovery in the 1970s, and it implies that the universe really is expanding, and apparently has been since the literal beginning of time. There's some talk of a singularity being a favorite component of that explanation, but physicists aren't really entirely certain about that. What they tell me is that they don't know anything prior to 10 to the negative 43rd seconds after the Big Bang, if in fact that is a fair description of what that is. But they say they actually know everything after that in spectacular detail. So we have only a very small window of the tiniest fraction of a second in which to speculate. Where did it all come from? There are many fallacious appeals to ridicule of what we actually know, one of them being that scientists are supposed to think that complex order, including life, was somehow created by an explosion. But no scientist believes that. Besides, the Big Bang wasn't really an explosion in the same sense that nuclear fusion isn't really the same thing as a fire. And it happened 9 billion years before the accretion of the Earth, so it couldn't have anything to do with the beginning of life either. Another creationist distortion is that the Big Bang is somehow part of evolution, and that evolution requires something coming from nothing. By evolution, they mean all scientific explanations that contradict their favorite fables, so nearly every field of science. But again, we didn't come from nothing, and no scientist believes that we ever came from absolutely nothing. The Big Bang is not something from nothing. Even when cosmologists talk about a universe from essentially nothing, they don't mean an absolute philosophical nothing. In fact, they don't think that an absolute nothing is even possible, because every time they try to create a perfect vacuum, they notice quantum fluctuations of subatomic particles popping in and out of existence where there shouldn't be anything. Otherwise, logically, we can't get something from nothing, right? So something must be eternal without a beginning, and it could be the matter and energy of this universe. Because we know from the theory of relativity that gravity bends the fabric of space-time, and extreme gravity punches a hole in it. That's what black holes were thought to be. So imagine we have all the gravity of the entire cosmos compressed into a single point. That could cause a rift in the time-space continuum. And maybe that could happen from either side of the boundaries of this universe, which means that all the matter and energy, which are interchangeable one from the other, could have entered this universe from a source of the multiverse, such that myriad universes could be popping in and out of existence like bubbles in the bottom of a saucepan coming to boil, and we'd never know about these other ones because we're trapped within this one. There's no reason why the multiverse shouldn't be eternal, but in a sense this universe could be also, at least the energetic matter in it, because another property of excessive gravity is that it slows down time. So again, if you had the combined gravity of all the matter in the universe compressed into a singularity, if you will, it would slow time down to a stop. So imagine an asymptote on a Cartesian coordinate system, which slows down time as you move backward through time toward the Big Bang, such that 1 second stretches out to equal infinity when t equals 0. That would mean that although the expansion of the universe had a beginning, the material energy within it is eternal. It was literally always here. It could also be that our universe changes states, that the one we're in, where entropy increases, was preceded by an earlier version where entropy decreases, and where energy is cumulative, where everything came together instead of flying apart until it reached a pinnacle where it reversed the physical laws to begin this alternate subsequent universe where everything slows down and gets colder instead. But even if we were to imagine that the matter of energetic material energy had to come from somewhere beyond the universe, outside of space and time, then remember that time is a fourth dimension, but it's only a temporal dimension. It could be that the Big Bang represents a fourth spatial dimension moving into and thus inflating three-dimensional space, the same way a three-dimensional object appears to appear out of nothing when trying to move through a two-dimensional plane. It would look to us like something coming from nothing, even though it really came from somewhere else before. And what could be the catalyst for all this, the first mover that the wanna believers want to imagine? Well, it could be the random motions of supercosmic membranes, or who knows what else. Why is the interior of our universe shaped like this? There is no indication that any intelligent agent even could have been involved in any of this. And remember that the sacred fables don't have a lot of credibility, being absolutely wrong about absolutely everything they claim that can be tested. So I would say that any of these other ideas are at least equally valid to the religious idea, except that we know that a God isn't possible at all. And the important thing is that this is all just speculation, including God. If there is no way to test any hypothesis to show which one has more or less credence than another, and if there's no way to eliminate which ones are completely wrong, then it wouldn't matter what explanations we come up with. Even if you're right, if there's no way to show that, to know that with no evidence to back it and no way to verify or falsify it, then it's effectively meaningless and doesn't warrant serious consideration. So where did everything come from? No one knows. Certainly not you. And you've no reason to pretend that you do, or to pretend that you know someone who does, because you don't. I've read your holy books, and they reveal that your God doesn't know it either. He doesn't even know where the sun came from, or what it is, or what the moon is. Everything the Bible says about the earth in relation to the rest of the cosmos is laughably, embarrassingly wrong, and has been known to be wrong for thousands of years. The more we know, the more it shows that God doesn't know any more than the ignorant, primitive, superstitious savages pretending to speak for him back in the Bronze Age when everyone thought the world was flat and no one yet knew anything that was actually true. So anytime believers hear that you can't explain the origin of life, the universe, and everything, they think that it means that it must have been this dog or snake girl or, more commonly, some dream of genie, when in fact all these ideas are equally absurd and none of them even could be the right answer. Whatever the reality is, it is surely far more abstruse and complicated than these creatures of the id. Gods and magic are the simplest and most infantile excuses men have ever invented to explain things they obviously didn't and still don't even want to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Hold on. Before we carry on. Thanks for Colorado Biker Prepper. Thanks, man, for bringing up the point that I forgot. That I want, besides Jim Barber, besides Mr. Batman, I want Darth Dawkins and Nephilim free. So that's Gary and Evan. This challenge, I want them to watch this. I want them to come up with a best argument, which I can tell you right now they will not be able to do because there is no argument. Aron Ra can obviously speak for himself, but the first part of this video where I challenged Genesis 1:1, I challenge Nephilim free, and I challenge Darth Dawkins to discuss the original, to discuss Genesis 1:1 in its original form. So let's go back to Aron. You know why? Because Aron is like, he's the man. He's actually, believe it or not, more entertaining than I am. I know it's not easy to figure out.
Did you just say that evolution is just a theory, as if it's only a theory and not also a fact? As if to imply that the foundation of modern biology is somehow uncertain? As if no one knows for sure or can prove that I'm wrong, so I can still believe whatever I want? No. It's not like that at all. I've covered this before. It's one of the foundational falsehoods of creationism. But since this is the Pratt list of points refuted 1,000 times, then it bears repeating. There's a difference between a scientific theory and a mathematic theory, and both are different from the colloquial notion that a theory is just a blind guess or empty, baseless speculation, like religion is. A scientific theory is a body of knowledge that begins with hypothesis, which could be interpreted as a guess, but one that is testable, meaning experiments can be devised wherein that hypothesis can either be verified or falsified. Those are the minimal requirements, or it doesn't even count as a hypothesis, because there has to be some way to show whether it is supported or should be discarded. Those are the only choices. So notice the obvious reason why religious beliefs will never submit to that. Because faith doesn't want to figure out how things really are. Faith wants to make believe something else instead, regardless of what the truth is. A scientific theory also has to be based on and explain factual observations of natural phenomena, which is another thing religion doesn't and can't do. For one thing, nothing that religions believe is ever observed. Instead, they're all made up. Likewise, saying God did it doesn't explain how anything happened or why things are the way they are. You can call it a miracle, but that doesn't explain anything, and it isn't true either. You can't call it truth unless you can show that it is true. Understand that the truth is what the facts are, and that unsupported assertions have no more validity than the claims that have been proven wrong. So any facts or knowledge you cite better be objectively demonstrable, or else you're making things up and talking out of your ass. If you can't show it, you don't know it. And if you can't show the truth of it, you can't say there is any truth to it. If you can't give us a reason to believe you, we have no reason to believe you, which is a pretty good reason not to. It's not like a theory could be proven and then become a law, either. And natural laws are just the summary statements or equations men devise trying to understand what they've observed. Theories are higher than laws. A scientific theory is a verifiably accurate explanation with practical application encompassing a body of facts, natural laws, and other associated hypotheses within that particular field of study. Intelligent design isn't a competing theory either. Creationism meets exactly none of the criteria required of a scientific theory. It isn't even a hypothesis because it can't be tested, and it doesn't have any possible potential reality to it either. It is literally no more than a delusion, a fixed false belief that will not change despite evidence to the contrary. The criteria required of a theory has been refined in modern times. It's much more strict now, with the standards much higher. That's why no scientific theory has been disproved in more than a century, because nowadays hypotheses kind of have to be proved already before they can graduate to the level of theory. Now let me explain. There is a rule that theories can only be disproved, that they can never be proven in the positive sense, no matter how certainly true they obviously are. That's why evolution is still a theory, because no one has been able to disprove it, the way we've already disproved so many of the claims of creationism. Theory is the highest level of confidence science can achieve. It's as close to proven as anything can be, if one applies the mathematic definition of proof, but that's not the one creationists use, so it's not the one I'll use when explaining it to them. Every modern scientific theory is a hypothesis that has been effectively proven, at least in a colloquial sense, by having profound explanative power, where all new information is concordant with it, by being consistently supported by all available evidence without contradiction, and having already withstood prolonged, substantial battery of tests and critical analysis in peer review. If we're using the terms applicable in a court of law, then evolution has been proven by an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. The same goes for other scientific theories too. Einstein's theory of relativity, for example, was effectively proven in the same sense, both with the observation of a solar eclipse warping light beams in 1919, and again with the discovery of gravity waves a century later. The National Academy of Science declares that evolution is both a fact and a theory, because every modern scientific theory both is and explains established fact, like the theory of gravity, relativity, tectonic plate theory, atomic theory, oxygen theory, cell theory, and the germ theory of disease. We know that cells are the basis of living organisms, that diseases are caused by germs, and that all matter is made of atoms. These are all facts as well as theories. If you've ever said this to anyone before, surely they've corrected such a glaring error, and you must have known since then that you're not being honest now. So when you say that evolution is just a theory, we hear you admitting that it is the only theory of biodiversity there ever was, and that it is just the best supported, most evidently credible, factually accurate, pragmatic, and truthful explanation there is for the origin of species.
February 12, 2009 was Charles Darwin's 200th birthday. Since then, a growing number of individual groups have held annual celebrations of science on Darwin Day. These typically feature animal shows, children's activities, and speakers promoting intellectual bravery and honest curiosity, as well as scientific skepticism and secularism, especially in areas where religious extremism threatens education. Creationists have told a lot of lies about our man Chucky D. They said that he didn't believe his own theory, that he thought that the evolution of the eye was supposed to be absurd in the highest degree. It didn't matter what he said immediately after that about what reason tells him. They said he recanted his belief on his deathbed, another lie flatly denied by his family who were at his bedside. Creationists often comment that Darwinism begat racism and that Christians accept that every human is one of God's children. They say that as if those who accept evolution cannot also believe in God. They don't know their own history either. Before Darwin ever published his theory, and for millennia before he was even born, many Christians commonly believed that different races were not even related. Before Darwin suggested common ancestry, both religious and non-religious people thought that the various races of men had no common ancestors at all. Some believed that the different races they perceived were convergently derived from different species, or that they spontaneously generated from different sources. Those who believed in God proposed other options. Mormons, for example, believed that black skin was the mark of the devil. Others believed that the Genesis character Cain got his mystery bride from among the apes. Still others believed that God created other kinds of people from other Adams that weren't mentioned in the Bible, and who predate anyone the Bible mentions by name. In another creation myth, the Titan Prometheus created both people and animals all out of clay, just like the Semitic gods did in Enuma Elish and Genesis, among other fables. Then each of these clay figurines had life literally breathed into it. The father god Zeus said that Prometheus made too many animals and forced him to turn some of them into men, albeit with bestial souls. This is the first reference to creationists believing that some people were fully human and that some were essentially soulless animals, but that's just the beginning. This theme was repeated again and again down through history. How could Darwin have instilled such racism into people that lived before him? It was not Darwin, but the authors of antiquity who numbered the races and called them inferior. Darwin proposed a tree of life where different lineages could be equally evolved. But Aristotle proposed a ladder of life where you have higher and lower life forms, where one race is superior to all others, not just in specific ways, but in general. And it was often the case that one group would refer to another as subhuman. It was so bad that in the 16th century, Catholic missionaries to the New World held a debate where one man argued that Native Americans were fully human. His four opponents, also in the Catholic clergy, argued that these tribes were soulless, thoughtless, talking animals in human guise. To be fair, it wasn't just the devoutly religious. In the 18th century, this problem was rampant among scientists and secularists too, including David Hume, Voltaire, and the naturalist George Buffon, who said that when white people moved to the tropics, they would degenerate into dark-skinned people. Buffon also said that there were 6 different species of human alive in his time. It was in this century, 100 years before Darwin, that the famous scientist Carolus Linnaeus classified humans into 6 different species: European white people, American red people, Asian yellow people, and African black people, in addition to chimpanzees and orangutans. Linnaeus was a Christian who didn't know about evolution, but he believed that humans were apes and also that apes were humans. The existence of gorillas hadn't yet been confirmed, and Linnaeus didn't know about Australian Aborigines either, but once they were discovered, the Australoid race was declared to be the lowest form of humanity, largely because they and gorillas were the same color. That's how superficial 18th century scientists were, and they weren't any better in Darwin's day either. This was the common language of both spiritualists and scientists alike from at least Plato's day, thousands of years before Darwin was born. So how was any of this his fault? In fact, in the year that Darwin was born, the children of black slaves were called objects of property and domestic animals, according to an American legal statute dated the same year as Darwin's birth. So how did Darwin's theory cause that? Abraham Lincoln was born in the same day and in the same year as Darwin, and Lincoln was extremely racist. He said that white people were generally superior and that blacks should not be voters or jurors or qualified to hold public office. He said they should be denied everything. Yet Lincoln is heralded as a great emancipator and Darwin is criticized as a racist? How is that fair? Even in the modern day, the evangelist Oral Roberts University would suspend students for interracial dating and expel them for interracial marriage. Even the Ku Klux Klan said they are exclusively creationist.
If you really read the Holy Bible, which the Klan is a very Christian organization, the Holy Bible actually separates the races.
Black people and white people are nowhere related. In my opinion, I think black people evolved from animals. And I believe that we need to be separated. Whites and blacks need to be separated.
Who decreed that?
God decreed that. Jesus decreed that.
So you think this is what a good Christian man does?
Yeah, this is our Christianity. I mean, that's just plain and simple.
So it is a bit hypocritical of Christians to criticize Darwin for being racist. Creationists have told a lot of lies about Darwin, but the worst of all of them was this. In 2001, Louisiana legislator Aron Broom submitted a bill saying that creationists believe that all men are created equal with inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. She said that the writings of Charles Darwin promoted the justification of racism because, she said, the core concepts of Darwinist ideology is that certain races and classes of humans are inherently superior to others. And she said that Hitler was a Darwinist who exploited these racist views. She's not the only one to say that, of course. I mean, I've heard this repeated hundreds of times over the course of my life, but it is a disgusting misrepresentation of all involved. For one thing, none of these people agreed with Darwin about anything. This is the very thing that Darwin argued against. This is what happens when religious extremists are in charge of everything. So much for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So much for Christians believing that all men were created equal. I challenged creationists many times to show me where Hitler ever promoted or accepted evolution, and they pointed me to Volume 2, Chapter 4 of Mein Kampf. There, Hitler mentions evolution and talks about what brought mankind away from the animal world. That does seem like he's promoting Darwin's idea, but in that passage, Hitler specifies that he's only talking about cultural evolution, and he says that man's inventions were the ticket, not any biological process. In that same paragraph, Hitler talks about what everyone who believes in the higher evolution of living organisms must admit. And again, it sounds like he's promoting evolution, but creationists don't recognize their own arguments in Hitler's words, because Hitler is criticizing a belief he does not share, which is why he questions how it all began. Hitler did mention natural evolution, and he equated that to the strong dominating the weak, something that Darwin never said. But it is clear from the context that Hitler is not talking about evolution in a Darwinian sense. Hitler talked about cultural, political, industrial, and military evolution, and the only time he mentioned natural evolution, he obviously meant it in the same sense. For this reason, some translations use the word development instead of evolution. When Hitler mentioned organic evolution, he was talking about management of an organization. Hitler's book never mentions Darwin's name, and only once does it refer to Darwinian evolution, in Volume 1, Chapter 11. I cited this passage in a number of videos where Hitler uses the same arguments that creationists commonly do. He says he accepts only microevolution, saying that evolution can only occur within definite limits, producing only subtle variants within their kind. He said that new diversity is limited to rare and inviable hybrids between those kinds, and he said that the emergence of new species is impossible. Hitler used all these common creationist arguments, saying things that no Darwinist would ever say. I've never seen any statement Hitler ever made where he even acknowledged Darwinian evolution, except this one passage where he rejects it outright. He even said that such evolution is a sin against the eternal Creator. Creationists, of course, don't want to admit that Hitler was one of their own, but they have no evidence to excuse him. By their own admission, the same criteria they would use against him would also excuse the majority of mainstream Christians today. We have no way to know what someone's beliefs are other than what they say. Hitler had always only ever described himself as a believer in God, as a Christian, and more specifically, a Catholic. But in this instance, he made plain that he was also a creationist. Elsewhere, Hitler even explained that his hatred of Jews was motivated by religious beliefs, not by science. As further proof that Hitler rejected Darwinism, he banned all of Darwin's books and ordered they be burnt. Joseph Stalin did much the same thing, albeit for different reasons. Both men wanted to believe that man's development could be controlled by ambition as an act of will, but reality isn't like that. Nature only allows you to play the cards you're dealt. Most importantly, Hitler praised racial purity and superiority, but Darwin taught that purity led to congenital defects and that superiority was a variable and determined by the environment. So Aron Broom was completely wrong about both Darwin and Hitler. Hitler's prejudice and Darwin's process could not be any more at odds. So I asked these creationists to show me where Darwin ever said anything to imply that he was a racist. It turns out that in all of his works there is only one passage which could be interpreted that way. What he said there does sound racist to a 21st century audience. However, remember that in 19th century England, every common man and anthropological authority in the entire global scientific community had for centuries taught that black people were the lowest form of humanity. So Darwin was only speaking the language that was ubiquitous everywhere at that time. It would be an adequate excuse to say that Darwin was a product of his culture in that age. But as it turns out, Darwin doesn't need that excuse. He was much more progressive than this one paragraph indicates, because he challenged both the societal and anthropological status quo. Remember that before Darwin proposed the idea of common ancestry, all the other scientists had for centuries believed that the races of men count as different species. And this idea was still common even among Darwin's contemporaries, like anthropologist Louis Agassiz. Agassiz was a staunch creationist who said that there were 8 different races of men.
And you know, I know of a Bible college in Australia, when I lived there many years ago, brought up in the city of Brisbane, there was a Bible college that taught that you don't take the gospel to the Australian Aborigines because they're not the same race as other people.
Remember that everyone in Darwin's world thought like this, from the clergy and throughout academia. Virtually every European believed that blacks were lower than whites and that different races were different species. So of course we can accept that Darwin believed the same thing. Except that he didn't. If you read his last book, Descent of Man, you'll see an evolution in his thinking, because in the first of the book he's saying the sorts of things you'd expect, but as the work progresses he begins to question the idea of multiple races. He said the word race was inadequately defined and not of any actual value regarding people. He said human beings were not sufficiently distinct to be considered separate species. Racist people, then and now, defend their notions of purity by saying,
I'll tell you this, oil and water don't mix.
So there should be some clear division. But Darwin said that our biased judgments against other people were superficial and erroneous, and that no matter how distinct other people may appear to European eyes, there was no consistent distinction, because some Africans still shared traits with some Caucasians, and the same was true of every other group too, so that every race blends into every other race at some point, such that it is impossible to determine any real division. To illustrate this, he noticed how even expert anthropologists may disagree and consequently categorize 2 individuals of the same ethnicity as though they belonged to different races. Most importantly, Darwin tallied the claims of other scientists of his day who couldn't even agree on how many races there were. He said, "Man has been studied more carefully than any other animal, and yet there is the greatest possible diversity amongst capable judges, whether he should be classed as a single species or race, or as 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 11, 15, 16, 22, 60, or 63. And this wasn't the only time that Darwin questioned the judgment of other scientists in his field. He remarked that people of his day were divided into 2 schools, monogenous and polygenous. The polygenous were apparently divided into 2 groups too. The first group Darwin described as creationists, those who do not accept evolution and must therefore look at different species as separate creations. The other group believed that men had descended from 2 or more species as different as orangutans and gorillas. But Darwin argued that if that were the case, then there would be clear indications of that in the comparative skeletons of men. Thus Darwin predicted that naturalists who admit the principle of evolution will feel no doubt that all the races of man are descended from a single primitive stock. He also predicted that once evolution was generally accepted, that the dispute between monogenous and polygenous will die a silent and unobserved death. That prediction seems to have come true in my lifetime. So far as I know, the last polygenists were the Christian Identity, a terrorist group with many subsets including neo-Nazis and Klansmen. According to the FBI, group members and affiliates are responsible for a number of weapons violations, assaults, murders, and bombings. According to the Anti-Defamation League, these affiliates include the Montana Freeman and Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. The Christian Identity believed that Anglos and Aryans were the true Israelites, and that Jews fall into a class of false people with no soul. One expression of their anti-Semitism is the seed-line theory, wherein white people descend from Adam and Eve through their good son Abel, and they say that the line of Jewish people began when Eve was impregnated by the serpent in the garden. And since they believe the serpent was the devil in disguise, then the Jews, in their view, were literally the bastard spawn of Satan.
In fact, it's the secular world that is leading the way in regard to dealing with the race issue biologically and not the Christian world. And you know why that is? Because so many churches have adopted evolutionary ideas in the Bible, so many churches have ignored Genesis and said, we don't want to deal with that, we're not sure if it's true, doesn't matter, and we concentrate in the New Testament.
But the fact is that we never see from Darwin any of the overt bigotry that was so common from practically everyone else in history until that time, including so many of his critics still living today. Quite the opposite, in fact. His book, On the Origin of Species, offered no support for either racial purity or superiority, despite the fact that it mentions favored races. In that book, he wasn't talking about people. Darwin was also often accused of having inspired the near annihilation of Australian Aborigines.
Back in 1924, there was a newspaper published called the New York Tribune, and it had a headline, "The Missing Links Were Found in Australia, the Australian Aborigines." Did you know, in fact, that scientists from Germany and England sent people to Australia with instructions on how to kill the Aborigines, how to skin them, how to boil up their skulls as specimens for museums? They paid property owners to herd them over cliffs, herd them into swamps and so on. This is all a part of Australian history, all in the name of evolution.
But in Descent of Man, Darwin recalls that as a tragic episode which was already underway years before he got there and decades before he published his theory. So he couldn't have had anything to do with that either, nor would he have. He apparently didn't believe in white supremacy either, because he defined savages more by their practice than their lineage. His journals on the HMS Beagle say that Europeans should prefer the dark skin of Tahitians to their own comparative pallor. He said that the finest people he had ever seen were Tahitians, and that the nicest man he ever knew was a free black military commander stationed in South America. Darwin abhorred every aspect of slavery and wrote extensively about that. But he also wrote against the favoritism of Caucasian invaders and opposed the genocide of indigenous tribes, and he often criticized his own race as contrasted with darker tribes whom he frequently praised. And yet, if you listen to Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis today, somehow it is the creationists who believe that all men are one race and that Darwin fueled racism. No. I submit this as one more bit of evidence that creationism is driven entirely by lies. Despite Darwin's upbringing in the ethnocentric aristocracy of Imperial England, Darwin was no racist. He was one of the most progressive men of his day, and creationists have done him wrong. Happy Darwin Day.
I wholeheartedly agree with that, you know. Now, in terms of time, we are, in terms of the playlist of that we're watching, we're pretty much about halfway through, and I was thinking that we've pretty much been alive for about an hour and a half. That's lots. So I'm thinking of calling it a wrap on this one. However, I do want to put out the challenge to Nephilim Free and to Darth Dawkins and to Mr. Batman. We will talk about Genesis 1, verse 1. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the original, without relying on translations. I can't thank you enough for sticking it out for 90 minutes. I know I'm not easy to take, but this, I guess there's a, what do they say? There's a top for every lid, whatever that means. Thank you so much. Please like, share, subscribe, and all the other stuff. And I will see you again pretty soon, hopefully. The original, without relying on translations. I can't thank you enough for sticking it out for 90 minutes. I know I'm not easy to take, but this, I guess there's a, what do they say? There's a top for every lid. thank you so much. Please like, share, subscribe, and all the other stuff. I'll see you again pretty soon, hopefully.
The original